The last two lectures have looked at the neuroscience of decision making, but that work focuses on relatively low-level processes, eye movements and wrist flexings. Since we normally think about free will in terms of adult decision making, it's important to consider what science has taught us about that. Here, you want to look at the various psychological contributions to decision making. There's still an enormous amount that we don't know here. In some important sense, we still don't have a scientific consensus on how decision-making in general works. And some theorists maintain that we will never get a good theory of decision-making, that it's just beyond our cognitive abilities. But one thing that is becoming abundantly clear is that our access to our own decision-making is limited. Much of what happens in decision-making, many of the things that contribute to our decisions, happen outside of consciousness, and that's what I'll focus on in this lecture. A long and venerable tradition in social psychology indicates that much of what happens in the mind is unconscious. In a landmark paper called Telling More Than We Can Know, Richard Nisbett and Timothy Wilson argued that we lack introspective access to the causal processes that generate our behavior. And one kind of evidence for this shows that we sometimes fail to recognize that one of our beliefs is causally responsible when it really is. That is, we know we have the belief, but we don't recognize that it played a causal role. And this is illustrated in an experiment that involved subjecting participants to shocks, electric shocks. And they were told that they would be given shocks of increasing intensity and that they were supposed to take as much as they could tolerate before telling the experimenter to stop. It seems like not a very nice experiment, but anyway, before the shock treatment began, all the participants got a pill. It was really a placebo, but half of them were told that the pill would cause heart palpitations, irregular breathing, butterflies in the stomach, and so forth. The other half was told nothing of the sort. Now, the experimenters didn't tell the participants that the symptoms, heart palpitations, irregular breathing, butterflies in the stomach, are characteristic responses to electric shock. So the ones who were given the pill and were told, you'll feel butterflies in your stomach, they didn't know or they weren't told that that's a characteristic response to electric shock. But based on earlier research, the researchers predicted that those participants would in fact take more shocks than the others because they would attribute the actual symptoms of the shock, their heart palpitations and the butterflies in the stomach, to the pill. So they would discount the symptoms and sort of think to themselves, well, that must be from the pill is doing that to me, it's not the shock. Well, that prediction was right. The subjects took 4 times as much shock when they were told that the pill would produce these symptoms. More importantly for our purposes, though, most of the participants did not realize that their belief about the pill affected their behavior. So a typical kind of response, they would ask the subject something like, I noticed you took more shock than average. Why do you suppose you did that? And they say that a typical answer was something like this. Gee, I don't know. Well, I used to build radios and stuff when I was 13 or 14, and maybe I got used to electric shock. And even when they were explicitly asked whether their thoughts about the pill made any difference, most of the participants said no. So they would ask them, while you were taking the shock, did you think about the pill at all? A typical answer was, no, I was too worried about the shock. So the participants had the conscious belief that the pill would produce these symptoms, and the belief apparently affected their decision about how much shock to take, but they failed to recognize that this belief played this role. They attributed their belief to other causally irrelevant factors like building radios or something. So here we have one striking case in which a person has a belief, a conscious belief, that's actually causally implicated in his behavior, but he doesn't know that that belief was causally effective. In addition to this, Nisbett and Wilson argued that sometimes people attribute a causal role to beliefs that are causally irrelevant. In a simple study, they asked people how much shock they would be willing to take in an experiment. One group was told that the shocks would cause, quote, no permanent damage. The other group was given no such reassurance. The former group said that being told that the shocks wouldn't cause permanent damage impacted their judgment. But in fact, it made no difference whatsoever, that they made exactly the same kinds of judgments about how much shock they would take, regardless of whether they had the phrase no permanent damage in their instructions. The conclusions that Nisbett and Wilson draw from these studies were that the causal processes that somehow convert our mental states into behavior are not transparent to us. We can't look into our minds and flawlessly determine which beliefs were causally responsible for which of our decisions, or our decisions at all. There was a wave of criticism of Nisbett and Wilson, and the most important challenge concerned what people were good at. Their paper gave some the impression that we have no special kind of access at all to our own minds, that we only ever theorize about what's going on in our minds, just the way we do when it comes to thinking about other people's minds. But this, it turns out, is really a gross exaggeration. For many mental activities, we are quite good at detecting what is happening in our minds. For instance, if you have someone solve a math problem in their head and then immediately afterwards ask them how they did it, people are terrific at this. So take a problem that admits of a couple of different solutions, like what is 6 times 29? Have people do that task and ask them how they did it. Now, 6 times 29, there are two obvious ways to go. One way is to multiply 6 times 9 and then carry the 5 and add it to the product of 6 times 2. So that's one way to multiply 6 times 29. Another way that requires fewer steps is to multiply 6 times 30 and subtract 6. What the researchers found was that people who reported doing the task in the way that required fewer steps were in fact faster than the people who reported doing it the other way. And what this suggests is that the people are correct in claiming that they use the shortcut method. This and much other evidence in the same vein shows that people really are very, very good at reporting on the steps they went through in solving these kinds of problems. And it's important to acknowledge this area of excellence. When it comes to things like determining how I solved a math problem, I am way, way, way better than any science that we have or look to have in any kind of reasonably near future. People are exceptionally good at this kind of thing, close to flawless. And we shouldn't lose sight of that in the rush to disparage human introspection. Nonetheless, the important issue for the problem of free will concerns whether we can tell which mental states cause which decisions. And here, Nisbett and Wilson are on pretty solid ground. The evidence that they adduce does suggest that we have significant limitations in our ability to know which thoughts cause our behaviors. Instead, Nisbett and Wilson propose that the way we figure out which of our thoughts cause our behavior is that we use an implicit theory. Now, theory here isn't supposed to mean anything very fancy. It's just sort of like a body of rules or knowledge or principles or something like that. And we use that theory to figure out which of our mental states cause our decision. And that's how we come to think, oh, this mental state, that's the one that caused our behavior, and that one didn't. We'll get a more detailed picture of this later in the lecture, but for right now, let me just emphasize that the idea is that when you try to figure out which mental state causes your behavior, you don't do it by looking inside and seeing the thing actually happen, seeing the causation occur. You do it by applying a set of principles to figure out, well, yeah, it seems like that's the one that did it. That was the causally powerful belief. So in Lecture 11, we saw that free will skeptics explain our belief in free will by claiming that we're ignorant of the causes of our behavior. The psychological research supports part of this claim. Apparently, we sometimes are ignorant of what causes our behavior. Now, the foregoing evidence is based on cases in which people are bad at knowing when their decisions are caused by beliefs that they're fully conscious of. There's never any question in these studies about whether the beliefs are consciously accessible. The issue is always just about whether people appreciate when a particular belief that they know they have influences their decisions. More recent work has made the related point that people's decisions can be influenced by unconscious thoughts as well. Now, of course, the idea of unconscious thoughts is familiar from Freud, but the contemporary work provides much, much more convincing evidence of the effects of unconsciousness than Freud ever did. I mean, it's in a different league. Many of these experiments, recent experiments, have worked by triggering unconscious associations that then affect decisions. Before we get to those experiments, though, I need to explain that the previous work, or some of the related work, that shows that activating a stereotype of an individual, even consciously, can affect behavior. Activating stereotypes affects the way we behave. And one of my favorite examples of this goes as follows. Researchers had one group of participants imagine a stereotypical professor and to list typical behaviors, lifestyle, appearance, etc. The other group was asked to do the same thing, except they were asked to imagine a typical soccer hooligan. And this was done in the Netherlands, where soccer hooligans were regarded as notoriously ignorant and difficult and problematic. After this portion of the experiment, where one group listed all the things about a stereotypical college professor, the other one about the soccer hooligan, participants were given questions from the game Trivial Pursuit. Those who had been imagining a professor did much better. To which my first reaction was, what? I couldn't believe this. The name of the article in which this was reported was How to Win a Game of Trivial Pursuit. So there's a bit of practical self-help advice. If you're playing Trivial Pursuit, think about being a college professor and you'll do better. So this is an example, though, in which the stereotype is activated consciously, but then affects behavior. In several ingenious experiments, Yale psychologist John Bargh induced stereotypes unconsciously. And he does this in all the different experiments. He does it pretty much in the same way, or the experiments I'll talk about. He has the participants first complete a scrambled sentence test. They think that this is supposed to be a test about decoding scrambled sentences, when really it's just to set them up for the next experiment. The real point of it is to expose them to certain words that would trigger certain unconscious associations and stereotypes. So in these scrambled sentences, participants are given 5 words, and they're told to come up with a 4-word sentence out of those 5. So if they're given the words home, he, at, work, is, they might come up with he is at home. And then they go on to the next scrambled sentence, and they fill out they complete many of these. And what Bargh found was that unconscious associations that were triggered by these scrambled sentences would change observable behavior. So in one experiment, the participants in one condition were exposed to words associated with elderly. And these words included gray, wrinkled, wise, Florida, and bingo. Apparently, these words are quite effective at activating the stereotype elderly. Previous work had shown that. The other group received words that were neutral, that didn't have anything that would activate the elderly stereotype. What the experiment revealed was that after these subjects went through the task of finishing the scrambled sentences, they were told, okay, experiment's over, now you can go home. And this is done in a high-rise building in New York. And as they walked out of the experimental room to the elevator, the researchers timed how long it took them to get from the experimental room to the elevator. People who'd been exposed to words like wrinkled, Florida, and bingo walked more slowly to the elevator. The explanation that the researchers offer is fairly compelling. They say, being exposed to words like bingo and wrinkled activates a stereotype of the elderly. Having that stereotype activated leads people to walk in ways that match the stereotype. However, the participants themselves rarely had any awareness of this. In post-experiment questioning, the participants didn't think that they walked slowly because they were thinking about the elderly. Indeed, most subjects weren't aware that they'd been induced by the scrambled sentences to think about the elderly at all. So here we have an unconsciously primed stereotype that is affecting behavior. Now, this is a pretty surprising result. Indeed, I was floored when I first learned about it. But it might not show unconscious influence on decisions, you might say, because it's not clear that the speed of one's gait is something that we think of as requiring a decision. The speed of walking often seems to be a pretty automatic thing. But another experiment targets decision more directly. In this experiment, the participants again completed a scrambled sentence task. One group got words that were associated with rudeness, another group got words associated with politeness, and a third group got neutral words. Each participant was told that when he finished his scrambled sentences, he should tell the experimenter that he was ready for the next part of the experiment. But the researchers had arranged for the experimenter to be engaged in a conversation for 10 minutes. So the participant would have to interrupt the experimenter in order to let her know that he was ready for the next part of the experiment. So what happened? 63% of the people who were primed with rude words interrupted the experimenter, whereas only 17% of those who were given polite words interrupted. Those who were given neutral words fell in between. 37% of those participants interrupted. As before, the participants were typically unaware that the words they saw had any effect on them whatsoever, but their decisions seemed to be affected by these unconscious associations, either to rudeness or politeness or no such associations at all. This study provides really striking evidence for the influence of unconscious mental factors on how we make decisions. And in these cases, it's much harder to deny, in this experiment in particular, it's hard to deny that the subjects are making a decision. Typically, when we're weighing whether or not to interrupt someone, we are making a decision. And that's what makes this experiment so impressive and so instructive for the idea that unconscious processes affect our decisions. Now, some of these studies have been taken as evidence of determinism, of psychological determinism, because they show that many mental processes we think we're in control of, many of those mental processes that we think we're in control of are actually controlled by factors outside of consciousness. The data do show that subtle non-conscious processes influence our decisions in ways that we didn't recognize before the work. But that doesn't really show that our decisions are determined. And I want to elaborate this a little bit because it's instructive about how it fits with the psychological research in general. The first point to make is that the results themselves are statistical results. That is, they show that by triggering different associations, people will show different responses at statistically significant levels. The different responses from getting different words can't be attributed to chance alone. That's what it tells us when we say it's statistically significant. And that demonstrates that the unconscious association influences psychological outcomes. It influences decisions. But that's a far cry from showing that psychological outcomes are determined. Let's just take the rudeness experiment as an example. Participants' decisions here about whether to be rude are influenced by whether they're exposed to different kinds of words. And this influence is not consciously available. The participants didn't subsequently explain their behavior by saying, well, I was exposed to these particular terms. So there were unconscious influences on their decisions. But if you recall the percentages, there's still a lot of individual variation in the decisions that people made. 17% of the people who got the politeness prime did interrupt. 37% of those who got the rudeness words didn't interrupt. And someone who believes in libertarian indeterminist free will can perfectly well maintain that indeterminist free choice accounts for some of the variation in the participants' behavior. Indeed, libertarians typically allow that our choices are constrained by factors that are not of our choosing, the factors that are themselves not of our choosing. Our genetic predispositions, our natural inclinations, and our automatic reactions all influence the outcomes that our minds produce. What Barge has done is reveal some hitherto unrecognized influences. But the libertarian can just say, well, there's a factor I didn't know about, but that's just another one of these factors that influence our decision. They wouldn't have to say, well, that shows that there's no indeterminist libertarian process at all in decision making. And the difficulty in getting experimental evidence against the existence of libertarian free will is that one would need evidence of something stronger than influence. We would need to show that the decision was entirely produced by a known set of influences. Current science is very, very far from anything like this. In fact, the difficulty in getting a scientific refutation of libertarianism is even greater, for it wouldn't be enough just to show that some decisions are determined. A libertarian can maintain that libertarian free activity is a relatively rare phenomenon. Perhaps it only applies to moral choices, for instance. And indeed, one prominent libertarian, Robert Kane, who's a philosopher at the University of Texas, maintains that even some of my, quote, free actions can be determined. He says, if I freely chose to develop a certain character trait a while back, that choice was made by a libertarian free will, let's say, that counts as a self-forming event. But that character trait that I freely chose back then might later determine my decision. But Keynes says, but it's still really free because ultimately the source of that trait was my free choice. So what's particularly interesting about this is that at that point, the libertarian can say, look, my libertarian choices might be quite rare. There may not be that many of them, but they are the key to my ultimate freedom and responsibility. And this really brings out how difficult it would be to get a psychological proof that indeterminism was false. And that's because determinism is a universal claim. It says every single event is determined. Libertarians don't think that. They don't think that their claim is universal. They don't think that every event is indeterministic. Indeed, as I said, some of them don't even think that every choice event is indeterministic. They just think that some of the critical decisions we make are not determined. So to use psychological evidence to try to prove determinism would require evidence to support the claim that every choice is determined. That is an enormous order, and at best it will be a very long time before psychology is in a position to prove the choice is never undetermined. While the available evidence doesn't prove determinism, it does show that there are important influences on our decisions that we fail to recognize. And this raises an important question. How do we come to think that a particular thought caused an action of ours? Part of the standard account we saw from Nisbet and Wilson is that we use an implicit theory to judge whether a given thought causes our action. And this idea has been developed in much greater detail by Harvard psychologist Daniel Wegner. Wegner begins by pointing out that it seems like most of the time when I do perform an action, it feels like I'm doing it. And most of the time when I'm not performing an action, it feels like I'm not doing an action. But he says there are cases where these things can come apart. First, it can happen that someone does something but disclaims the action, says it's not mine. One bizarre illustration of this is the phenomenon of anarchic hand, where one hand will do something that the other hand will try to stop. We see this in Dr. Strangelove, where the character's right hand will try to perform a Nazi salute and his left hand will try to restrain it. It's funny in the movie, but it happens in real life too, and it isn't so funny there because it happens in victims of stroke and other forms of neurological dysfunction. So in one case, a woman's anarchic hand would grab her throat during the night, and so she started to tie up her arm when she went to bed. In another case, a woman reports that she would reach into her closet to grab her clothes, and that her left hand would grab something that she didn't want, and she'd get really frustrated and throw it on the bed. And yet another patient who exhibited these kinds of anarchic hand symptoms, he first told an examiner that he wasn't doing the actions, but then he quickly added, quote, "Of course I know that I'm doing them, it doesn't feel like me." In these cases then, people perform actions that are in some sense their actions, but they don't feel like their actions. Wegner thinks we also get cases of the opposite dissociation, cases in which we feel like we're doing something even though we aren't. And he gives an example from his own experience where he walked up to a video game and started moving the joystick around, watching an on-screen monkey hop over barrels. Wegner says he got really involved in this, making the monkey jump and move, and then the game displayed the phrase, "Start game." It turned out that he hadn't been playing the game at all. It was just the game demo running on its own. And he says that when he started playing the game, he could immediately tell the difference. But before it said "Start game," he really thought he was in charge of the monkey. So there are cases where a person feels like they did something that they didn't, and there are also cases in which a person does something but doesn't feel like it. And Wegner says that should give us pause. It should force us to confront the question, what leads me to think that I performed an action or I didn't perform an action? And Wegner says we think that we perceive our free choices directly. We just see them. Like, that's how it is to us. We just see whether or not we performed an action, what thought caused it. But he said really what we do is we use a cluster of three principles when we're trying to determine whether a thought caused our action, whether a particular thought caused our action. We tend to think, he says, a thought causes an action when the following conditions are met. First, the action is consistent with the thought. Second, we see no alternative causes for the action. And third, we become aware of the thought just before the action. Wegner maintains that we can see the principles, each of these principles, in operation in the mistakes that people make in experimental conditions. And perhaps his best example is an experiment that's called I Spy. This is actually a complicated experiment, but it's instructive because it's his best illustration. So Wegner and his student Talia Wheatley arranged an experiment that was modeled on Ouija board movement, in which two players moved a platter that was attached to a mouse. Originally, they actually tried to do this with a real Ouija board, but it turned out that some of the subjects were apprehensive because they thought there might be evil spirits in the Ouija board. So they had to scrap that idea and use a computer screen covered with objects and this mouse that had a platter on top of it, and the pointer was set up on the computer screen, of course. Now, two players were in this experiment, two apparent subjects, but it turned out that one of them was really an accomplice. So there was one real participant, and one of them was an accomplice who was in cahoots with the experimenter. This is what they were told. The players were instructed to stop moving the mouse about every 30 seconds, and then they were supposed to indicate on a clipboard in their laps the extent to which she felt like, each person was supposed to indicate the extent to which she felt like she stopped the mouse intentionally. Both players wore headphones, and they were told that they would hear music and words in the background, but they would be different for the different people. But really, the accomplice would just hear instructions telling her which object to stop on and when. For the real subject, some of the words that played in the background were words that corresponded to objects on the screen. So one question the experimenters had was, would the words that the participant heard affect where she stopped the mouse? And the answer was no. When the participant stopped the mouse, it wasn't correlated to the words that they actually heard. Now, the real question that they were interested in once they got that out of the way was, what if the mouse ended up at an object that corresponded to the word, but because the accomplice moved it there, how would the real participant react? So this is what they did. The participant would hear a word, like the word swan, that was consistent with where the accomplice stopped the pointer, namely on a picture of a swan. But the words would occur at different intervals in different conditions. In some cases, the word would occur 30 seconds before the pointer stopped. In other cases, 5 seconds before the pointer stopped. Participants indicated that they felt like they intentionally stopped the pointer when they heard the word swan 5 seconds before it stopped on the swan, but not when they heard the word swan 30 seconds before it stopped. And this is exactly what Wegner's theory predicted. As I said, he thinks there are 3 principles that guide our judgment about when a thought causes an action. And even though the participant didn't really stop the pointer, we know that the accomplice did that. She concludes that she did because all 3 principles were met in this case. The action was consistent with the word. So the action was consistent with the thought, the word that was passing through her mind. The word was swan, and the pointer was on a swan. Second, there was no obvious alternative explanation for why it stopped. The subject didn't have any reason to suspect that the other player was in cahoots with the experimenter. And third, the action occurred just after the thought word swan went through their head. Indeed, a crucial part of the data is that when the thought occurred too early, people didn't have the sense that they intentionally stopped the pointer. And all of this goes to suggest that there's something right about Wegner's theory. When his conditions are met, people seem to think that a particular thought of theirs caused an action, even when it didn't. If Wegner's right, then along with Nisbet and Wilson, we never directly perceive a causal relation between thought and action. It's only through a process of inference or theorizing that we come to think that one of our thoughts caused an action. Wegner's done a great deal to articulate the principles that guide this process of inference. But what does it entail for the real question, or the big question, what is the relationship between thought and action? One radical possibility is that thoughts don't cause action at all. It's just an illusion that thought causes an action. That would be a radical form of epiphenomenalism, much worse than what we were left with after Libet, because it would say it's not just that you become aware of your decision afterwards, it's that your conscious decision, you're not even tracking anything. It's just your thought is just an irrelevant thing it's not even like you're tapping into anything that caused your action. But there's no evidence that suggests that this is a really plausible view. A more appealing view is that our thoughts really do often cause our actions, even though we sometimes make mistakes. Wegner might be right that the way we judge whether a thought causes an action is by using these principles, and that can lead to various kinds of mistakes. But it still might be the case that we often get it right. So the psychological work reveals a number of surprising phenomena that occur beneath conscious awareness. And part of the way that we judge the causes of our own actions is by an implicit theory. Does this show that we lack free will? Well, it certainly doesn't prove that there can't be libertarian free will. But it does emphasize ways in which we really don't know our own minds nearly so well as we had thought. And that might provide a reasonable challenge to our belief in free will. The point is not that the evidence refutes free will. Rather, the problem is that libertarians suggest that the belief in free will is based on our internal experiences of our choices. But if our access to our choices is limited, as it seems to be, then we need to wonder whether our belief in free will is really well justified. This is perhaps the greatest threat posed by the evidence that we lack introspective access to what causes our decisions. Since many of the influences on our behavior are hidden from us, it's hard to be confident that our experience of free will is to be trusted.